The princess did not scream. She only clenched her teeth so tightly that those standing by the wall could hear them crunch. The emperor, however, screamed, while his flesh peeled away from his bones, while boiling vinegar ate away at his groin, while gray slime dripped from his mouth, and his tongue swelled to the size of a fist. His eyes remained open until the end, as if he wanted to make sure she was watching, and she was watching. In the spring of 1526, in Szeged, at the court of the so-called imperial consul, began what later chroniclers would call the second collapse of the Hungarian crown. It was not a conspiracy or a rebellion, but a series of silent evening meetings, from which the participants left pale, without saying a word, even to their wives. The reason for these meetings was rumors about the emperor's illness, at first barely audible, then crude and detailed. At the end of March, Chancellor Gabor wrote in his diary, "The Lord only speaks in the mornings. After lunch, only the smell of his mouth can be heard. Close servants assure us that his right arm no longer bends, and his fingers are covered with a blue crust like those of a drowned man." Other sources indicate that the ruler ate only liquids, often lost control of his bladder, and fainted 3 times while receiving ambassadors. Servants avoided curtaining the windows. Darkness allegedly irritated him, and he began to mutter in an ancient language known only to 2 courtiers. He was now washed not with water, but with a solution of salt and alcohol. Otherwise a cloudy, purulent mass would ooze from the cracks in his skin. A doctor sent from Esztergom recommended placing leeches behind his ears and draining at least half a liter of blood from his femoral vein every 3 days. This was done at night, on the floor, by the light of 2 candles, and the blood flowed thick, black, and almost odorless. After a week, it began to smell like iron and rotten fish. Mentions of pain disappear from the records around the 20th of April. Instead, words such as fever, swelling, bulge under the shoulder blades, and soft pulp under the ribs appear. The emperor did not complain. He could no longer speak. His lips were cracked, his tongue was ulcerated, and his breathing became hoarse, as if something thick was rattling in his lungs. The seizures began with him tapping his fingers on the headboard as if beating a rhythm, and ended with convulsions of his legs and foam coming out of his nostrils. The servants called it rebellion within the flesh. The emperor's wife, Louise, was initially denied access to his chambers. She was kept in the East Wing, her isolation explained by sanitary regulations and impropriety. Only when rumors began to spread that she was praying for her husband's death was she allowed to see him, first for a few minutes, then for the night. Cardinal Roche's report states, "She was pale but calm. She sat by his bedside without touching the sheets. The next morning, she vomited blood." 3 days later, she asked Father Roman to read prayers of repentance over the dying man. He refused, citing the stench in the room and the unclear state of the sick man's mind. By May, the body was unrecognizable. Dr. Adam Kovats left notes, later found in the basement archives. The internal organs are rotting faster than the outer skin. The abdomen is swollen like a dumpling. There are blisters in the groin as large as chicken eggs. One of them burst, releasing a thick whitish liquid mixed with yellow. In the same handwriting, the smell after the bandages were removed was like rotting cabbage and greasy fried skin. In the morning, it was worse. After lunch, it was unbearable. The soldiers guarding the chambers began to change every day due to nausea, fainting, and bad dreams. One of them was found dead in the stables, his lips bitten and his fingernails torn off. The body was burned without a funeral service. The emperor's voice returned only once, when he screamed so loudly in the night that the entire western part of the palace woke up. The servants who rushed in found him sitting up, his neck twitching, and bloody saliva dripping onto the pillow. He never opened his eyes again. When, on the morning of May 3rd, the guard Joseph, not waiting for his shift to end, went outside and cried out on his knees, blood was already flowing from his nose. Later, it would become clear that this was purulent sinusitis, caused by a long stay in the stench. But at that moment, it was considered a bad omen. At night, what they called crying behind the wall reappeared in the corridor, a dull, drawn-out moan, as if someone were sobbing, but without tears or breath. The guards found no one. In the morning, the Duke's entourage asked that his chambers be moved to the lower halls, so that it cannot be heard in the temple. However, it was already impossible to move him. The Emperor was left untouched. At the slightest touch, his skin tore like wet paper. His fingernails had completely fallen off. His knuckles were swollen, and ulcers had formed between them, oozing fluid. The tissue on his chest began to spread, and dark shadows resembling worms crawled under his skin. Servants said that he was boiling from within. This coincided with his temperature, which remained high despite the cold linen bandages and infusions. According to a report from a herbalist from Mohat, his body temperature could be felt through 2 layers of fabric. His blood was thick and smelled of iron and vinegar. His urine was cloudy and flaky. Suspecting gangrene, the doctor tried to cauterize the tissue under his shoulder blades with a red-hot forged spoon. It was recorded. The Emperor did not cry out, but something thick, like pig fat, flowed from his ear. After that, the procedure was stopped. A little later, in a letter to Bishop Chenadi, it was stated, "They tried to save his soul, but his body was already rotten to the bone. He is breathing, but the smell is like that of a grave. God has turned his face away from him." At this time, a struggle began in the palace. Advisor Tekeli promoted the idea of urgently transferring power to the emperor's young nephew. The guard refused to obey as long as the monarch was still breathing. The courtiers from Louise's entourage opposed this. They were satisfied with the situation in which power remained under the cover of illness. During the emperor's lifetime, the actual transfer of power took place in closed rooms by candlelight. Several attempts were made to arrange a secret audience, to sit the dying man in a chair, cover his neck with fur, and whisper answers to him while the council read the decrees. But his body could not hold the position. Pus oozed from his rear passage, and his belly was so swollen that it was impossible for him to sit. Louise again tried to get her husband to confess. The court confessor refused to enter. He had already vomited once at the door. Then the woman had to wash her husband herself. From the maid's report, her dress was soaked through. She washed his feet, and the skin came off the soles of his feet. Then she prayed for a long time, sitting on the floor, smelling of herbs and dead meat. Toward the middle of May, the dying man began to swallow his tongue. As was later written, this is a sign of dying neurons. He made muffled groans, similar to moans, but they had no meaning. His forehead was covered with purple spots. His lips were stuck together, and small ulcers appeared on his neck, which burst and filled with a dark liquid. Later, they were cut open and found to contain a mass resembling moldy cheese. When the skin on his stomach began to crack, this happened on the evening of May 20th. The bandages fell off. One of the servants later said, his stomach cracked like an overripe pumpkin. Something like warm gray porridge came out of it. I ran away. The next morning, his abdomen was bandaged, but after another day, the skin split open again, this time under his ribs. 2 dark pieces emerged from under the flesh, presumably disintegrated parts of the liver. The cardinal, who arrived that morning and did not enter, he only raised his finger and said, "There is no life here anymore, only the shell remains." That evening, the final stage began. Decay starting from the head. Hair fell out in clumps. The skin on the forehead began to peel, and spots appeared underneath. One of the doctors, examining the wound, moved his finger, and the first larva emerged from the cut part of the forehead. There were only a few, but one of the nuns screamed and was taken out. 2 days later, new ones began to move under the left eyebrow. Then Louise was forbidden to approach. Officially, he was still alive. He was fed through a sponge placed in his mouth. Although he had no swallowing reflexes, fluid leaked from his mouth and nose, and one night a maid, wringing out a sheet, found a worm in it. After that, the room began to be fumigated with resins. It smelled of wet wood, then rot, then resin again. The doctors did not approach without oil bandages on their faces. One of them wrote, "The smell of the body lingered in my nostrils for 2 days. I ate garlic and drank juniper infusion, but it didn't help. It felt like I'd carried the rot out of the palace in my own mouth." Inside, everything was falling apart. The news that the emperor could no longer be shown reached the ambassadors. The envoy from Saxony demanded an official examination. In response, he was invited to an audience with the curtains drawn. He refused. Soon, one of Louise's brothers was found dead, strangled with a belt in his own chambers. The official version was suicide. But 3 days earlier, he had asked for a meeting with the chancellor to tell him about secret instructions at the bedside. His papers disappeared. The servant who had served him was expelled for damage to property and adultery. By the end of the month, no one knew for sure whether he was alive. His heart was still beating, but his body was rotting. His intestines were oozing. Maggots filled his ears, and a murky substance slowly oozed from the open seams on his head. It seemed that death had settled in him like a guest for a long time. It was not until early June that Cardinal Roche entered his room again. He wrote, "I looked as if into a hearth. There was fear, but also clarity. There was no longer a man before me, only something that had once breathed." He read the absolutions over him, quietly, rapidly, without touching the body. Witnesses would later say that the body shuddered, as if something had stirred inside it. They hoped that he would die before the feast of St. John. It would have been symbolic, convenient, and would have simplified the change of power. But the body did not die. It rotted, swelled, and crumbled. But the heartbeat, they called him a living corpse. And among the cooks there was a saying, "If the emperor is still alive, then death will avoid us." In early June, at midnight, one of the servants noticed liquid dripping from under the bed. At first, they thought it was a chamber pot. Then they realized that the mattress was soaked through and something thick, dirty yellow, with streaks of blood was oozing from the body. When they tried to change the sheets, one of the maids fainted. They revived her with vinegar and cold water, but she screamed that he spoke to me with his eyes. The emperor was no longer moving. His eyes were open but unfocused. Sometimes it seemed that his pupils were reacting to light, but it was an illusion. Pus and film accumulated between his eyelids. The skin on his face turned ashen. His cheekbones were sharp and gaunt. One rumor said that when his hair began to fall out, there were holes underneath, in which maggots were wriggling. The chancellor tried to convene a secret council to declare him dead, but that would have meant the end of the entire order. As long as the body lived, the crown could not pass. Too many people were waiting for that moment. The army, the religious council, the heirs from the collateral line, all were like crows on a ledge. One mistake, and blood would have flowed down the palace stairs. Louise, in effect, became regent. She no longer tried to wash her husband, but slept in the next room, read psalms, and kept the key to his chambers. Guards appeared at the doors, not for protection, but so that no one would see, because in mid-June he began to leak. The doctor who examined him in those days wrote, "The skin on his neck peeled off like old bark. Underneath was flesh, loose and bloodless. His chest was buzzing, not from breathing, but from internal decay. You could hear a splashing sound. His ears had turned black, and his earlobes had fallen off. One night, a maid wiped his cheek and removed part of his face. Under a layer of soap was pus, and under that, bone. Soon, small white worms began to emerge from his nostrils and eye sockets. They were collected with a spoon and wiped away with rags, but new ones appeared every day. The servants stopped entering without gloves, and then stopped coming altogether. Now only Louise was with him, alone, in a stinking, rotting room. She did not lose her mind. On the contrary, her face became smooth and calm, like an icon. She did not scream or pray aloud. She just stood there. A couple of times she was seen holding his hand, without fingers, with rot between the bones. Then she began to sit, never taking her eyes off his face. Rumors whispered that she was talking to him. In the second week of June, the smell of sulfur appeared in the chambers. At first, they thought it was new mixtures from the doctor, but then the walls began to sweat, and they realized that the stench was coming from inside the body. One witness wrote, "It seemed as if something was boiling in his stomach, and the vapors were seeping through his pores." He was turned over again, and a wet mess was found under his waist. Later, it would be described as entrails dissolved in heat. Attempts to embalm the body while he was still alive were unsuccessful. Resins and oils were not absorbed, but on the contrary, repelled by the skin as if it were dead wood. One of the doctors even squeezed something out of the body through an ulcer, which he later described as decayed fat mixed with corpse mucus. People said that death would not come, that he was eternal in his decay, that God had turned away. The priests were silent. Even the young chaplains avoided conversation. At night, lamps were lit in the corridors, and salt was left out. Several times, dead animals were found at the doors, rats, birds. Once, a dead baby was found, thrown out by one of the poor. The empire was crumbling. Ambassadors were leaving. Monasteries in Pesh and Oradea refused to send prayers. One of the cardinals called him a deceiver of death in a letter to the Pope, and inside the palace there was only silence, fog, and damp walls that smelled of flesh. And only at the end of June did something change. At night, when Louise was sitting next to him again, his body twitched. It wasn't a spasm or a breath. It twitched as if someone was coming out from inside. A dark mass gushed out of his stomach, with bubbles and pieces of something soft. Louise didn't scream. She just covered her mouth with her hand. Worms began to emerge from the wound, many of them, alive, white, writhing. They covered the sheet and dripped onto the floor. Louise did not run away. She watched. Then she stood up, opened the door, and said, "He's empty." He didn't die right away. After the worms and black slime flowed out of his stomach, his heart continued to beat for 3 more days. They called him a living vessel for rot, a contaminated saint, a man without a soul. The body no longer breathed in the usual sense. The chest did not rise, the eyes did not close, but the veins in the neck still twitched, as if something was pushing them from within. Louise did not leave the room. Her face turned pale, like a wax mask. In the mornings, she was silent. At night, she listened. At times, it seemed as if the rotting mass in the bed was whispering. No one dared to check. On the 4th day, after the outpouring, Bishop Vorotsky was brought in. He refused to enter the room. Standing at the door, he dipped his fingers in oil and pronounced the formula of absolution. The priest, who was supposed to perform the last confession, fainted from the stench. He was carried out on a rag held under his armpits. The death was officially recorded on the 3rd day of July, but the report of the chapter says there was no pulse on the morning of the 2nd. However, the stench prevented anyone from approaching to confirm this. His eyes were open, his lips were cracked like dry earth. When pressure was applied to his chest, brown foam flowed out. A later treatise attributes his death to septic explosion of internal organs as a result of gradual decay of the entire body. The burning of the body was forbidden. An imperial burial ritual was to be performed, but the craftsmen who were supposed to prepare the corpse fled. 2 died of fever, and the 3rd committed suicide. Monks had to be called. They nailed the windows shut, poured vinegar over the body, wrapped it in a skin, and boiled it for 8 hours in a mixture of herbs and lard to stop the decomposition. It did not help. The skin burst, the worms did not die, and fluid continued to ooze through the cracks. Louise was taken to a convent. She remained silent. According to one of the maids, the Empress's last words were, "I feel him inside me." She died in the convent 40 days later from what was described as rot in the stomach. The funeral took place at night, without people, without pomp. Only 2 priests, 5 soldiers, and a closed coffin. It was said that it was filled with tar. The burial place was hidden. One of the diaries reads, "In the dungeon of the castle, under the old altar, together with him are the knives that cut open his wounds and rags soaked in pus." And the next morning, the massacre began. The collateral heirs announced their rights. The army refused to obey the council. Executions began in several cities. The reformers accused the bishops of concealing the death. Catholics declared Louise a witch. The common people said that he did not die of illness, but of a curse, and began to burn herbalists and widows. The old nobility disappeared in 3 weeks. Some were thrown into wells, others into swamps. Some were strangled, some burned, some poisoned. The empire collapsed. Later medical records say that the cause of the disease was a purulent abscess that spread to all internal organs. One of the treatises on the body of the dead ruler says, "The disease began in the groin and spread upward, turning the intestines into a liquid mass. Worms appeared in the 6th week. His eyes lost their reaction to light on the 5th week. He stopped speaking on the 4th day. Rumors that his flesh continued to live after death have not been confirmed, but they have not been refuted either." On the wall of his bedroom, under layers of soot and mold, many years later, an inscription was found. "He burned from within. He looked at me until the end.